Lamentations chapter 1, so the very beginning of the book, first verse says this: How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces. How is she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen. She findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. The ways of Zion do mourn because none come to the solemn feasts. All her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Her adversaries are the chief. Her enemies prosper. For the Lord hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. And from the daughter of Zion all her beauty is departed. It's gone. Her princes are become like harts that find no pasture, deer that find no pasture. And they are gone without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembered in the days of her affliction and of her miseries all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, and none did help her. The adversaries saw her and did mock at her Sabbaths. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned. Therefore she is removed. All that honored her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she sigheth and turneth backward. Her filthiness is in her skirts. She remembereth not her last end. Therefore she came down wonderfully. She had no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy hath magnified himself. And that's where we're going to stop reading. I want you to know there's little to no doubt among biblical scholars, theologians, that Jeremiah was God's instrument used to pen these words of Scripture, Lamentations. The idea of lamentations, weeping, sorrow, sadness. So Jeremiah was God's instrument, yes. I want to recall briefly, just briefly, to introduce what we're talking about here today, the life and ministry of Jeremiah. And I'm going to say it very succinctly, and there's a lot to be said, because God says a lot about his instrument. Jeremiah was a faithful man of God. He was called to be a minister and to preach to a nation which God knew was very rebellious. And I want to emphasize that point, because I do think it's important in the day and age in which we live. And if you are going to be like Jeremiah, just say a faithful person of God, there's a lot of similarities we can draw from this. But God knew that he was preaching to rebellious people. Now, why is that worth noting or mentioning? Because I want you to think about the difficulty, and I want you to think about the emotional struggle for a man whose life calling, this is his life. This is what he knew God had called him to do. If you'll recall in Jeremiah chapter 1, God talks rather a lot about being formed in the womb of his mother. And he knew before he was even formed. So you see, that's God's eternality at work, and knowing all things before they even come to pass. This was Jeremiah. This was his calling. This was his life. Called to preach to God's people and to anyone who would listen. So he was going to preach to nations who did not like, we could just say it that way, what he was saying. People who have little to no interest in what he was saying, who would mock him for what he was preaching, teaching, and believing, and occasionally would want to even kill him. All because of what he was saying, all because of the words that were coming out of his mouth. This faithful man of God. Shut your mouth. Stop it already. We don't want to hear it. Get over it. Stop preaching these things to me. Rebellious nation, rebellious people, hateful people, evil people. This, in a very small nutshell, is what we read and what we glean from the life and ministry of Jeremiah. He was constantly preaching God's truth to rebellious people. So I say all that to say, no wonder God allowed or gave us this book of the Bible called Lamentations. Jeremiah, faithful, weeping, sorrowful, sadness, constantly and continually. And again, we read it a lot. We can read about a lot about his life and his ministry. So here in Lamentations, we begin to see a lot of the grief and despair about what kind of toll this life of ministry has taken on him. God is using him not only to allow us to see what it is like for faithful people to do exactly what he is doing, being faithful to God in the face of rebellion, trying to live in a world where the majority of people want no part of what you believe, will mock you for it, living life as a Christian, living righteously in this present world, but also what those consequences are. What are the consequences of that? And if, asking the question, will we be what God needs us to be? If we do not live our lives according to the truth that God has imparted unto us, there will be consequences. That is part of God's truth. It's one thing. Now listen to this, and you need to really understand the context of what I'm saying here. It's one thing to come to church on Sundays. Listen to a Bible study on Tuesday or Wednesday nights. Go to youth functions. Participate in, quote, all things church. And another thing, to live your life according to those truths that you are hearing and learning and professing to believe. Those are two different things. I hear it. I go to church. I go to Tuesday night. I go to Wednesday night. I go to youth functions. I do things church related. It's one thing to do that. And it's another thing to live your life according to the truths that God's instruments have shared with you. Jeremiah, faithful man of God, preaching, teaching. Hey, listen up. Hear what God is saying to you. I want you to know this is exactly what we are reading about in our text this morning. Jeremiah, faithful man of God, preacher of the word, Israel and Judah, God's called or chosen people, might we say the church, delivered the truth, the oracles of God, so they could be examples to the rest of the world. That's what God wanted, intended to use his people for. These things have been put together by God. So what is the problem? What are we reading in Lamentations? What is this all about? The conclusion is, and what we are reading about this morning, grieving pastor crying out to God because his congregation is rebellious, sinful, not living the way God has called them to live, not living according to the truths that he is professing. So I don't want you to misunderstand. This is not this pastor talking to this congregation saying you're rebellious. That's not what I'm saying. Hopefully nobody thought that, but it came to my mind, so I'm sharing it with you. Rather, this is God's indictment on his church as a whole. This is God saying, what has happened to you people? I have given you everything, and in return, you have not given yourself to me. You have not given me everything, because that's what he is asking of you. And what God's people need to also understand, which we have already read in the text, is that there will be consequences for that kind of rebellion. And I know it's not a popular message. It's not. And they don't want to hear it. That's why they turned away Jeremiah. That's why sometimes they try to kill him. Stop it. Shut your mouth. I don't want to hear it. Why do you think they say that? Accountability. God's truth. This is what you need, not what you want. For all of these reasons, we see time and time again God's people, the church, rebelling. And it will especially be true of the church, but also true of people who will not turn their heart towards God. They don't want to hear this. So look for a moment at what God is specifically sharing here as it pertains to the message. The very first verse in the very first chapter of Lamentations is a strong indication of what God is about to get into. Look at that verse again. How doth the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How is she become as a widow? And I hope you notice the title of your message today is The Widow. And we'll make application of that. But listen to what God says. How is she has become as a widow? She that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces. How has she become tributary? So in other words, how does this city, the city of God, the city created and blessed by God, sit solitary? In other words, how is it sitting alone? This great city that God has blessed and given. Sitting alone. How is it desolate? It was thriving. It was vibrant. It was blessed by the great God, Lord, creator of all things. What has happened to this place? Do you see? This is, again, the context of Jeremiah. Lamenting. Lamentations. How has this happened? God is asking, how has she become a widow? Now, we understand the context of what a widow in earthly relationships is, don't we? We all understand what a widow is. The loss of a spouse through death. Everybody here understands that. But listen, in a spiritual context of what we are reading, this great city of God losing its spouse, which would be who? The city loses its spouse, become a widow. God himself. How have you become a widow? Losing the Lord himself, God asked through his prophet, how could this be? How could this happen? God's people should never be without their spouse, ever. God has told us time and time again, has he not? I am married to you. I am married to you. I will never leave you or forsake you. As long as you stay true to me, this will always be the case. In other words, you will never be a widow for me. You will never lose me in a spiritual context. And yet, this is not the case here in verse 1. And throughout the following verses, this is what is so important for you and me and all of God's people to understand throughout the message in these texts. It is the simplicity of how great, how this tragic event, if you will, how it can happen. Spiritually speaking, how we can all be widows to God. Where he is dead to us. We are no longer together. We are not married anymore. It can only happen in one singular way, and that way is when we marry him, come together with him in a moment of faith, but then we, with the emphasis on we, you, me, all men, not God, fail to maintain our commitment to him. The only way we can be a widow in the context in which God is presenting. That's it. That is all. The only way it can happen. We must choose to be faithful to him. That is the pinnacle of our being or of our life. And when I say pinnacle, that is the best, the utmost, the highest, the greatest. It is the pinnacle of our life, is to be committed to God through Jesus Christ. If we have married God, And if we are staying faithful to Jesus Christ, then biblically speaking, we are promised, we are guaranteed, we are assured that God will see us through any and everything in this life. And we will certainly see eternity with Him. That is God's objective biblical truth. If you will marry me, and if you will stay committed to me, you will never be a widow. Spiritually, you will always be mine, and I will always be faithful to you. This is God's promise, no doubt, but God's people must also see the dangers and the consequences of what happens when they don't stay committed. And that's exactly what we're reading about in Lamentations. We only read 9 verses. Have you ever read the entire book of Lamentations? It's all it is grieving and sadness. Why have you done this? How has this happened? But I want you to understand something about God giving us the dangers, the consequences. Because I want you to know, just to use maybe another earthly example, I want you to know that I'm going to profess before you today, I am not a good parent. I am not a good parent, a good father, and neither are you. If you never told your children the consequences of making bad decisions or ungodly decisions. If I never told my child that they could get hurt or die if they ran out in the middle of the street without looking when they like to play in the front yard, I'm going to ask you the question, what kind of dad am I? I never warn you of the danger of playing in the front yard with all these cars whizzing by? Think about that. It's logical. It's simple. If I never told my children the consequences of drinking alcohol and what it can do in your life, or how many alcohol-related incidents or accidents there are in our country every single day because this is what people choose to do, what kind of dad am I? What about the consequences of drugs, the consequences of premarital intimacy, or the consequences of cheating? You name it. There are multitudes of sin we can name, but the question and the point is simply this: what kind of father am I if I do not teach my children the consequences of not doing it God's way? Who am I? What am I? And I want you to understand something here. These are not scare tactics. God forbid. Never to be a scare tactic for my child or from God to His people. It is simply a reality check. And God's truth speaking to your life, where do you stand in your relationship with Him? Is that not a fair question from God, the creator of all eternity, who wants to love you and be committed to you and wants you to be committed to Him? It's a fair question. It's an honest question. Where do you stand in your relationship with Him? Are you being faithful to what He has revealed to you is true? And if you're not, then God is a good enough daddy to tell you, hey, you're not being faithful. You're not doing what's right. I hope you perceive that as love and not a scare tactic and not a strict dad. Are you listening to your call upon His call upon your life? Are you being committed to living life His way? Those are the questions a good father, a good mother would ask. Those are the truths that we must teach. Not just to our children, by the way. Good earthly example. But to each other. To each other. Time and time again, I'll tell you how much I love you and that we are a family. What kind of pastor, what kind of friend, what kind of Christian brother or sister am I? If I see or perceive something, or if I want to ask you a question, hey, is this a good thing for God? And you look at me and you say, well, who do you think you are? No, this is God's people being accountable to God first and to each other. Please don't ever perceive it from me any other way than that. These are all good questions for our spirit, not just today, but every day. If the answer is yes, Lord, I'm trusting you now in this moment, then I want you to know there is nothing to fear. You're trusting God with the truth that you know there's nothing to fear. But if you're not, maybe there is. Undoubtedly there is. This is something a good dad will tell you. God's faithfulness shows us both the good, the great, the beauty of the relationship, and also the dangers of not maintaining it. His faithfulness shows us the consequences of not being committed. And today's text in Lamentations is what happens when God's people do not stay committed. That's the simplicity of what we're reading. And so in light of all we've said this far, and I'm going to end with some more scriptures. Listen to these words again that we've already read. Verse 2. She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Why? Why is that? Because there's nobody there to comfort her. Because as God said in the first verse, how has she become as a widow? Because God is not there. Because she has been unfaithful. There is no one to comfort you. God said in the relationship He would always be there. That's God's promise. So now I'm asking you, where is He then? Where is He? There's no relationship, He says. It's not here. Have you ever heard of a one-person relationship? It doesn't exist. If you say yes, it doesn't exist. It takes two. It's a relationship. A relationship always by its nature and by its meaning and definition takes two. You and God is saying, I am present, but you aren't. And then verse 2 continues, among all her lovers, she had none to comfort her. In other words, you have been faithful to everyone else. You love everything else. You love all these other things, all these other people, all these other, as he called them, lovers, except me. And God's asking the question, where are they? Now where are they? When it really matters, where are they? You satisfied your flesh by going places, doing things you should have never done. Now God's asking, where are they? They're not committed to you like I am. Furthermore, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. All her, quote, friends have dealt treacherously with her, meaning they've tricked you. They said they were your friend. You thought they were your friend. They have acted, as the word means in the original language, covertly with you. They tricked you. You thought they were treating you right, but deep down they were using you. They were not really your friend. They weren't doing the right thing all along. Therefore, they have become your enemies. They are against you. So I want to ask you, the people you call friends, what kind of qualities do they have about themselves? What is their character? That's a good question. Do they love the Lord, their God, with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength? Are you careful about those things? Do they lift you up in your relationship with God, or do they pull you away from Him? And I would just caution you as a piece of godly counsel, choose wisely. I'm not saying you can't befriend somebody who doesn't love God. I would never say that. That's legalistic. But you need to choose your friends wisely. What kind of character? Are you going to let them hurt your heart? Choose wisely. We could go through all of these texts today, and I'm about to close, but we could go through every single one of these texts, examining exactly what happened with Judah, with Israel, God's people, all day long. But we don't have the time. I hope you get the point this morning. I want to share this last verse with you that really sums it all up. Look at verse 8, if you're still in your Bible. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned. Therefore she is removed. That is the consequence of what she has done. All that honored her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she sigheth and turneth backward. Again, simply said, this is the consequence of being unfaithful to God. When you sin against God, when you rebel against God, when you do not put him in his rightful place in your life, the ultimate consequence of that, if you do not make it right, is removal. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned, therefore she is removed. That is God's truth, not mine, for emphasis and for clarity. But I also want you to know the great thing about God, good daddy, right? The best daddy, the best father who could have ever existed. Way better dad than I'll ever be, you'll ever be, the greatest dad. We could maybe come up with a list among the billions and billions of people across the world. Who was the best dad, the greatest dad? God's infinitely better, right? Okay. The best thing about God is that where there is life, and I mean physical life right now, life and breath, you and I are all breathing. And we're present together, and we're asking God to share his truth with us, right? So there's life, and there's breath, and there's presence. We're all here together hearing God's truth. I want you to know the greatest thing about God is that there's opportunity. I love that word, opportunity. If there is one person here today whom God has spoken to, where you say in your heart, Lord, I have sinned against you. Lord, I have not put you first in my life. I have not been living the way that you want me to live. Forgive me. Forgive me. I want to tell you some good news. God will forgive you. He will forgive you. He is good, that good, and he is that faithful. So our message today, be sure you are right where you need to be with God. Right now, this moment, and today. And as I've said before, you may have walked in these doors today unfaithful, sinful, rebelling. We're here, we're breathing in the presence of God. We're asking for his truth to speak to the heart. Maybe through the words, but I think more through the Spirit. And if you will be faithful to him in a moment and trust him and stay committed to that relationship today, tomorrow, the next day, the next week, the next month, one moment at a time, God will be faithful to you if you will stay committed to him. God is that good. And I love him for it. And I hope you do too. So I'm asking, can you do that for God? By the grace of God and your act of faith, will you do that for God? Amen.